Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to the story. It all began one rainy evening in a quiet little town in Texas. Mark Davis, a 23-year-old law student, was trudging down the street, his backpack slung over his shoulder, feeling the weight of the world on his tired shoulders. He was deep in thought, his mind consumed by the constant pressure of balancing his studies, his part-time job, and the debts left by his late father. His steps were slow, almost as if the weight of his responsibilities was literally dragging him down the street. He stopped at the corner, glancing up at the dark sky, his eyes scanning the sky for any sign of a break in the storm. The rain was relentless, falling in sheets, making the streets shine like mirrors beneath the dull glow of streetlights. Mark was soaked, but he didn't mind. At that moment, he felt numb to the cold. He had grown used to this feeling of emptiness, as if he was walking through life without purpose. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He fumbled for it, pulling it out, and saw an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Mark Davis? The voice on the other end was calm but firm. It belonged to a woman, and there was an air of authority in her words. Yes, this is Mark. I'm Eleanor Brooks, the voice continued. I need to speak with you. It's about your financial situation. Mark's heart skipped a beat. His financial troubles weren't exactly something he'd openly discussed with anyone, let alone a stranger. He opened his mouth to ask how she knew about his debts, but she cut him off before he could say anything. I know enough, she said smoothly. Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7:00 p.m. It's important. And just like that, the call ended. Mark stood there for a moment, his mind racing. Eleanor Brooks? He had heard the name before. The Brooks family was one of the wealthiest in the area. But what could she possibly want with him? He didn't have time to dwell on. He had a choice to make: ignore the call and continue wallowing in his problems, or go meet her and find out what this mysterious offer was all about. With no better options in sight, he made his way to the bistro. The rain was coming down harder now, and by the time he arrived, he was drenched to the bone. The bistro was warm, a cozy little restaurant with soft lighting and the scent of freshly brewed coffee hanging in the air. He stepped inside, shaking off the cold, and was immediately greeted by a woman who looked like she belonged in a place like this. She was sitting at a corner table, dressed in a sharp suit that made her look both elegant and commanding. Her silver hair was styled impeccably, and she had an air of someone who was used to getting what she wanted. Mark took a deep breath and walked over, sitting down across from her. Mr. Davis, she said without skipping a beat, her eyes never leaving his. I've been following your situation for a while now. I know about your father's debts, and I know you're barely scraping by. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. I'm here to offer you a solution. Mark frowned, confused. A solution? What do you mean? Without hesitation, Eleanor placed a folder on the table between them. I'm offering you a deal. Marry me. Mark blinked, completely taken aback. Marry you? I don't even know you. She gave him a small smile, almost as if she had expected this reaction. It's not about love, Mr. Davis. It's a business arrangement. In exchange for your marriage, I'll pay off all your debts, guarantee your financial security, and give you the chance to live a life you've always dreamed of. All I need is a companion, someone to share my name, my estate. Someone who will help solidify my legacy. Mark sat there, stunned. This was insane. Who would even consider such a thing? But then, his eyes flickered to the folders she had placed on the table. It was an offer he couldn't afford to ignore. He didn't love the idea of marrying a woman he had just met, but the weight of his debt, the looming threat of losing everything, pressed on him harder than any moral qualms he might have had. I'll give you time to think about it, Eleanor said, breaking his thoughts. But don't take too long. This offer won't be on the table forever. Mark sat back in his chair, his mind racing. What had he gotten himself into? As he stared at the folder, Eleanor's calm gaze remained fixed on him, waiting for him to make a decision that could change everything. As Mark sat at the table in Brooks' bistro, the reality of the offer before him began to sink in. Eleanor Brooks, the woman sitting across from him, was every bit the formidable figure her reputation suggested. Her perfectly tailored suit, the sharpness in her eyes, and the calm confidence in her voice all screamed power. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone, least of all to him. Mark, on the other hand, was feeling the pressure of his life closing in around him. His father's debts, the looming threat of eviction, and the uncertainty of his future weighed heavily on his shoulders. He had nothing left to lose. Or so he thought. The silence between them was thick, the hum of quiet conversations from other tables seeming distant as Eleanor's words lingered in the air. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind racing. "Marry me?" The words repeated in his head, mocking him with their absurdity. How could he even entertain such an idea? But the weight of his reality was undeniable. His life was at a standstill, and Eleanor's offer was the only lifeline within reach. He looked at her, trying to gauge whether she was serious or simply playing some sort of game. Her expression remained unchanged, her cool demeanor almost unnerving. Mark took a deep breath and finally spoke, his voice low. "Why me?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Eleanor didn't hesitate, her eyes locking onto his with a steady gaze that betrayed no emotion. "You're young, unattached, and you need the money," she said plainly, as if reading from a script. "I'm offering you a chance to escape your financial burdens and secure a future. All I need is a companion. Someone to share my life with, someone who can be part of my legacy." Mark's eyes narrowed. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "I don't even know you." He ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to process the absurdity of it all. Was this some sort of joke? Or was she really offering him a way out of the mess his life had become? Eleanor's gaze softened ever so slightly, though her composure never wavered. "I don't expect you to fall in love with me," she continued, her voice soothing yet matter-of-fact. "This isn't about that. It's about practicality, about securing a future for both of us. I don't have time for games, and neither do you. I can give you everything you need. In return, I ask for your companionship, nothing more." The room felt suddenly smaller as the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Mark was still processing everything she had said, but the reality of his situation kept pushing him back to one inevitable conclusion: he needed to do something drastic to change the course of his life. He leaned back in his chair, staring at her for a long moment, considering the proposal. A marriage of convenience? It felt so wrong, so impossible. Yet, the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like his only option. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. "And if I say yes? What happens next?" Eleanor didn't even flinch. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a set of papers, sliding them across the table toward him. Mark glanced down at the documents, his eyes skimming over the fine print. "It's a contract," she explained. "A legal agreement that ensures both of us are protected. We'll sign the papers, and you'll start your new life. I'll pay off your debts, set you up with everything you need. The arrangement is simple. You live with me, share my name, and attend events as my husband." Mark's heart began to race, the enormity of the situation dawning on him. This wasn't just a business deal, it was a complete upheaval of everything he knew. His world was about to be turned upside down. He looked up from the papers and met her eyes once again. Her expression was unwavering, as if this was just another day at the office for her. But for him, this was life-altering. "You expect me to sign this, just like that?" Mark asked incredulously. "No questions, no second thoughts?" "It's not about love, Mark," Eleanor replied with a hint of warmth in her voice. "It's about survival. For both of us. The world works in strange ways, and sometimes, we need to make unconventional choices to secure our future. Think about it. You'll have everything you've ever dreamed of. No more struggling. No more fear. Just a future." Mark looked down at the papers again. His mind raced. He had never imagined his life would take such an unexpected turn. But Eleanor was right about one thing: he had nothing left to lose. He reached for the pen she had placed on the table and hesitated for just a moment. His hand shook slightly, the weight of the decision sinking in. But then, with a deep breath, he signed the papers. The sound of the pen against the paper echoed in the quiet room. As he handed the papers back to her, Eleanor gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Welcome to the family, Mark," she said softly, her voice holding an air of finality. Mark felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, fear, and something else he couldn't quite identify. He had just signed away his freedom, but in return, he had gained something he never expected: security. But at what cost? Only time would tell. The days that followed were a blur for Mark. After signing the papers, he found himself caught in a whirlwind of change. His once humble apartment was replaced by a lavish mansion that felt as cold and empty as his heart. The overwhelming luxury of it all was both a relief and a reminder of everything he had left behind. Eleanor didn't give him time to second-guess himself. She had already arranged everything: new clothes, a driver to take him wherever he needed to go, and a personal assistant who was at his beck and call. The house was spacious, far too large for one person, and the silence that filled the halls only made Mark feel more alone than ever. He spent his days adjusting to this new life, a life that, while comfortable, felt hollow. Eleanor kept to herself mostly, her business dealings taking priority over their marriage. Mark didn't mind. The arrangement was simple: no expectations, no love, just a partnership in name only. He went to events with her, played the role of the perfect husband, but every time he looked in the mirror, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living someone else's life. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, that made him question the choice he had made. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Mark glanced at her, surprised by the warmth in her touch. "You're doing well," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You've adjusted quickly." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Mark felt a pang in his chest. "It's not exactly what I imagined," he replied, his voice quiet. "But, it's fine." Eleanor's smile faltered for a moment, and for the first time, Mark saw a crack in her composed exterior. She looked away, her gaze distant as if lost in thought. Mark couldn't help but wonder what went on in her mind when she wasn't busy keeping everything under control. Over the next few weeks, Mark began to notice something strange. Eleanor, despite being the powerful woman she was, had moments of vulnerability. He saw it in the way she sighed after long meetings, in the rare moments when she let her guard down, and in the way she looked at him during their quiet dinners. He wasn't sure if it was his imagination or if something had changed between them, but it felt like the lines between their fake marriage and real emotions were beginning to blur. One night, after a particularly long day, Mark was in the living room, reading a book. He heard footsteps approaching, followed by a soft knock on the door. It was Eleanor. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, but her eyes told a different story. For the first time, she didn't look like the commanding, powerful woman who controlled everything around her. She looked tired, human, vulnerable. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft. Mark nodded, setting the book down and motioning for her to sit. Eleanor stepped inside, slowly, as if unsure of herself. She sat down across from him, her posture tense. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "This arrangement, it's not easy for either of us." She paused, her fingers twisting together nervously. "I know we made this deal, but I never expected it to be this complicated. I thought it would be simple, just a contract, no emotions involved. But here we are." Mark looked at her, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected this. He had been so focused on surviving, on getting by, that he hadn't really considered what Eleanor might be feeling. Her words caught him off guard, and for the first time, he realized that maybe he wasn't the only one struggling with this fake marriage. He took a deep breath, his mind racing as he considered her words. "Yeah, I didn't think it would be like this either," he said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. "But here we are." He let the words hang in the air, unsure of where to go from there. For a moment, the room was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Then, Eleanor did something Mark never expected. She reached out and took his hand, gently but firmly. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not in the way you imagined. It was simply a moment of connection between two people who had been living in the same house but hadn't truly seen each other until now. Maybe this was all part of the plan, Eleanor said softly. Maybe it was meant to be this way. A contract that turns into something more. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for something he wasn't sure he could give. Mark stared back at her, unsure of what to say. The path he had chosen was already set, but in this moment, he wondered if they were both fooling themselves into thinking that everything could remain strictly business. He felt a stirring in his chest, a longing for something more than just survival. As Eleanor's hand rested in his, Mark realized that he didn't just want to get by anymore. He wanted more. And maybe, just maybe, this contract wasn't the end of his story, but the beginning of something far more complicated and far more real than he had ever imagined. The days continued to blur into one another as Mark adjusted to his new life. His existence was no longer marked by the mundane struggles of rent and unpaid bills. Now it was defined by the polished halls of Eleanor's mansion, the constant sound of high heels clicking on marble floors, and the ever-present weight of the contract they had signed. Mark was living a life of luxury, but something inside him longed for more than just the empty comfort of wealth. Eleanor had offered him everything he thought he wanted: security, status, a way out of his old life, but it was all still a cage of sorts, one where the bars were made of wealth and prestige, not freedom and love. Yet, despite the distance between them, something was slowly changing. Eleanor, who had once kept herself guarded and distant, began to show a different side. She would sometimes sit with him during dinner, and for the first time, Mark noticed the subtle hints of warmth in her eyes when they spoke. Her smile, once calculated, became more genuine as she shared little stories from her childhood, fleeting moments of vulnerability that showed a woman who wasn't just a successful businesswoman, but also a human being with fears, desires, and hopes. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Mark found himself sitting on the balcony of their massive estate, staring out at the sprawling gardens below. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The scene was beautiful, almost surreal. He took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh air as he tried to make sense of everything. He had always dreamed of living a life like this, but now that he was here, it didn't feel as fulfilling as he'd imagined. There was no sense of achievement, no feeling of truly earning it. Everything had been handed to him on a silver platter, and it was starting to feel hollow. He was still lost in his thoughts when he heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Eleanor stepped onto the balcony, her presence both commanding and calming. She was dressed in an elegant black dress, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked every bit the powerful woman she was, but there was a softness in her expression tonight, a look Mark hadn't seen before. "I was looking for you," Eleanor said, her voice gentle yet firm. "Are you okay?" Her words were unexpected, and for a moment, Mark didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to Eleanor asking about his feelings. She had always been the one to keep her emotions at bay. He shrugged, not knowing how to explain the mix of emotions he was feeling. "Just thinking," he said quietly. She nodded, her eyes steadying him with a look that seemed to see through the walls he had built around himself. For a moment, they both stood in silence, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind and the distant hum of the city. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You know," she said, taking a step closer to him, "I didn't expect this arrangement to be so complicated." She paused, as if gathering her thoughts. "When I proposed this to you, I thought it would be simple. A contract, a partnership. No emotions involved. But it's not that easy, is it?" Her words hung in the air, and Mark felt a strange lump form in his throat. For the first time, he saw a crack in her armor, a vulnerability he hadn't noticed before. Mark turned to face her, his heart racing. "No," he said, his voice low. "It's not that easy. But we both agreed to this. We knew what we were getting into." He paused, his thoughts swirling. "At least, I thought I did." He met her gaze, and for the first time, he felt like they were both seeing each other for who they truly were, beyond the titles and the money. Eleanor's lips curved into a small smile, but it was bittersweet. "I never wanted a fake marriage," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted someone to share my life with. Someone who would understand meant just my wealth, but me. The real me. Her words were raw, and Mark could feel the truth in them. Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just the wealth or the luxury that made him feel alive, it was the connection he was beginning to feel with Eleanor. For the first time since they had entered this arrangement, he felt like they weren't just two strangers bound by contract. They were two people, real people, starting to see each other for who they were beneath the surface. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, the touch tentative but genuine. "Maybe we didn't expect this to be easy," he said, his voice steady, "but we're both here now. And we're not as alone as we thought we were." He looked into her eyes, searching for something he couldn't quite put into words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the world around them had faded away, leaving only the two of them standing in the quiet of the evening. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence, her voice soft but full of meaning. "Maybe we can start over," she said, her words carrying a sense of hope Mark hadn't expected. "Maybe this contract is just the beginning of something more." Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time since signing those papers, he didn't feel trapped. He felt like he was standing at the edge of something new, something real. The days that followed felt like a turning point for both Mark and Eleanor. They continued with their routine, attending events together, but there was a shift in their dynamic. What had started as a cold, business-like partnership began to grow into something more complicated, more real. Eleanor was still the powerful, poised woman who commanded every room she entered, but Mark started to see glimpses of the woman behind the mask. He noticed the way her eyes softened when she spoke about her childhood, or the rare moments when she allowed herself to be vulnerable in his presence. One evening, after a long day, Mark found himself in the study, sitting in front of a large desk piled with papers. He had been working through some of the details of Eleanor's business plans, trying to be more involved in her world, when Eleanor walked in. She was holding a glass of wine in one hand and a faint smile on her face. Mark looked up at her, surprised to see her at this hour. "I thought I'd find you here," she said with a small chuckle, setting the glass down on the desk beside him. "You've been burying yourself in work again. You're starting to look like you belong here, in this house." Her words were light, but there was an underlying sincerity in her tone. Mark smiled faintly. "I guess I'm getting used to it," he replied, pushing the papers aside to give her more space on the desk. "I never thought this kind of life would feel normal, but here we are." He paused for a moment, looking up at her. "How about you? You seem like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders lately." His voice was soft, and there was a concern in his eyes that he hadn't allowed himself to express before. Eleanor's expression softened as she sat down next to him, the wineglass forgotten on the table. "I don't know what it is," she said, her voice quieter now. "This whole arrangement was supposed to be simple. Just a business deal. But it's starting to feel different. Like maybe I'm asking for something more than I bargained for." She sighed, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the desk. "I thought I could live this way forever, detached, unfeeling. But with you here, it's not so easy to pretend anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for something she didn't seem to find in her own reflection. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he listened to her words. The vulnerability in her voice, the rare honesty, made him feel closer to her than he ever had before. It was a side of her he hadn't seen, and it made him realize that maybe he wasn't the only one who had been pretending. "I never meant for any of this to get complicated," Eleanor continued, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I think you've changed things for me, Mark. I wasn't expecting to feel like this." She paused, looking at him with a mix of hesitation and hope. "Maybe it was always meant to be this way. Maybe this contract was just the beginning of something more than I could have ever imagined. But I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I can be vulnerable like that again." She took a deep breath, her gaze softening. "What about you?" she asked, almost as if she were afraid of the answer. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. She had laid her feelings bare, and for the first time, he realized that the feelings he had tried to suppress had been building inside of him. He had come to this house as a man in survival mode, someone just trying to get through the next day. But now, as he sat next to Eleanor, he realized he was starting to want something more. Something real. He reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly on the desk. "I didn't expect any of this either," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I came here thinking I was just playing a part in a contract, trying to make the best of a bad situation. But now, I'm starting to think this is about more than just survival. I'm starting to think that maybe what we have could be more than just a business deal." He looked into her eyes, the connection between them undeniable. "Maybe we don't have to keep pretending. Maybe we can give this whatever this ice an honest chance." His words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, the first real admission of his feelings. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if time had stopped, and the world outside had faded away. Then, she smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. "Maybe we can," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Maybe we can try." She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, and for the first time since they had met, Mark felt like he wasn't just pretending to be someone he wasn't. He was finally being himself, vulnerable, honest, and open. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Mark didn't feel like he was alone, and as he looked into Eleanor's eyes, he realized that their journey was just beginning. The days that followed felt like a new chapter for Mark and Eleanor. They had both made the decision to step beyond the confines of their contract, and for the first time, they began to explore the real connection between them. The walls they had carefully constructed around their lives started to crumble, bit by bit. They no longer just played the part of husband and wife for appearances. They were starting to see each other as real people, two individuals who were more than just a business arrangement. Mark found himself waking up earlier than usual, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He wanted to make the most of his time with Eleanor. Every day was a chance to learn more about her, to see the woman behind the mask of power and control. Eleanor, too, began to open up in ways she hadn't before. She'd tell him stories from her childhood, how she had always been expected to be perfect, to be the one to carry the family legacy. She talked about the loneliness that came with being in charge, the pressure to always be strong, and the sacrifices she had made for her success. It wasn't just their conversations that were changing. Their interactions were becoming more genuine, more intimate. Eleanor would catch him looking at her, and for the first time, she didn't look away or mask her feelings with a smile. Instead, she'd hold his gaze, almost as if she were silently asking if he felt the same way. And Mark did. He felt it in the way his heart skipped when she smiled, in the way he found himself wanting to share his deepest thoughts with her. One evening, after a particularly long day, Mark and Eleanor found themselves alone in the living room. The soft glow of the fireplace illuminated their faces as they sat on the couch, the tension that once hung between them now replaced with a quiet, comfortable silence. Eleanor was leaning against the armrest, her eyes closed as she let the warmth of the fire envelop her. Mark, unable to resist, reached for her hand. "You've been quiet tonight," Mark said, his voice gentle. "Is everything okay?" Eleanor opened her eyes, and for a moment, Mark could see the faintest trace of sadness in them. She gave him a small smile. "It's nothing," she said softly. "Just thinking." She paused, her fingers curling slightly around his hand. "You know, for so long, I thought I had everything figured out. I built this life, this empire, and I thought that would be enough. But somewhere along the way, I lost touch with what really matters. And then you came along." She looked up at him, her gaze steady. "At first, I thought you were just a way to solve my problems, but now I realize that maybe you're what I needed all along." Mark's heart swelled as he listened to her words. For the first time, he could see the vulnerability that had always been hidden beneath her composed exterior. She wasn't just the strong, successful woman he had first met. She was someone who had been searching for something more, just like he had. He squeezed her hand gently. I think I needed you too," he said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I came here thinking I was just trying to survive, but now I realize I'm living for something more. Something real." Eleanor's eyes softened, and she sat up a little straighter, her face inches from his. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I never expected any of this. I never expected to feel this way. But here we are, aren't we?" Mark nodded slowly, his heart racing. This was no longer just a contract. It was something far deeper, far more meaningful. He leaned in, closing the distance between them. "Here we are," he said, his voice low and filled with sincerity. Their lips met in a kiss that was tender at first, hesitant, as if they were both unsure whether this was the right step. But then, as the kiss deepened, the uncertainty melted away, replaced by something undeniable. It was a kiss that spoke of everything they had been through, the struggles, the pain, the loneliness, and everything they had found in each other. When they finally pulled away, breathless, Eleanor looked at him with a new sense of clarity in her eyes. "Maybe this was always meant to be," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "Maybe we both needed this, a chance to finally be honest with ourselves." Mark smiled, his heart full. "Maybe we did," he agreed, his fingers gently brushing a lock of hair from her face. "But we're here now, and that's all that matters." The future was still uncertain, there were challenges ahead, and they both knew that their journey together wouldn't always be easy. But for the first time, they both felt ready to face whatever came next together. In the days that followed, Mark and Eleanor settled into a new rhythm. They had crossed the line from being two people bound by contract to being something far more complicated, partners in a journey they hadn't expected. The connection between them grew deeper each day, and the house that had once felt like an empty shell now felt like home. Mark still couldn't believe how much his life had changed in such a short time. He had come to this mansion with nothing but a contract, but now he was living a life that felt fuller, richer, not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of emotion. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Eleanor and Mark were sitting in the study, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the room. They were talking, as they had been doing more frequently lately, about their pasts, their dreams, and the challenges they both faced. Mark had never expected to be able to open up the way he had with Eleanor, but somehow, it just felt natural now. "You know," Eleanor said, her voice soft as she looked at Mark across the table, "I spent so many years convincing myself that I didn't need anyone. I thought I was enough, that I could do it all on my own. But now I see how much I was missing. You've made me realize that. Not just the luxury or the comfort, but the companionship. The feeling of not being alone in this." She paused, her eyes searching his face for a response. Mark listened carefully, his heart touched by her words. He had come into this arrangement thinking that he was just trying to survive, but now he was beginning to understand something much deeper. Eleanor had opened herself up to him in a way that no one else ever had. He could feel the weight of her past, the years of solitude she had endured, and the courage it had taken for her to let him in. "I get it," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "I've been there too. I thought I was just trying to get by, but now I realize I'm starting to live. I don't know if I've ever felt this way before." He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and steady. I think we're both learning that there's more to life than just surviving. There's something to be said for living with purpose, for being with someone who understands you." He smiled softly at her. "I didn't expect any of this, Eleanor. But I'm glad it's you I'm here with." Eleanor's eyes softened, and she reached out, her hand brushing against his. "I didn't expect it either," she whispered. "But I'm glad it's you too. I never thought I could feel this way again." She paused, her fingers lightly holding his. "I know this wasn't the plan. But maybe the plan was always for us to find each other." She took a deep breath, letting the silence linger for a moment. Mark looked at her, the connection between them undeniable. "Maybe the plan wasn't just about the contract," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe it was about us finding something real, something worth fighting for." He squeezed her hand gently, a quiet promise of something more to come. Just then, the sound of a phone ringing broke the moment. Eleanor's phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at it. The smile on her face faltered slightly as she saw the name on the screen. It was her lawyer. Someone who had always been a reminder of her business world and the life she had carefully built. She hesitated for a moment before picking up the phone. "I'll be right back," she said softly, standing up and walking toward the other side of the room. Mark watched her go, his mind still processing their conversation. He had no idea what the future held for them, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. He felt like they were on the verge of something important, something real. As Eleanor spoke on the phone, Mark sat quietly, reflecting on everything that had changed since he first walked into this house. He had come here looking for a way out of his past, but what he had found was a future he hadn't dared to imagine. And now, as he sat there, listening to Eleanor's voice in the other room, he realized that maybe, just maybe, they were both ready to take the next step together, whatever it might be. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor's connection continued to grow. The moments they shared were no longer just about fulfilling obligations or maintaining appearances. They were real, meaningful moments, conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning, quiet walks through the estate, and stolen glances that spoke volumes without a single word being said. Mark had started to realize that the life he had once been handed wasn't the one he had imagined. The life he was now living it with Eleanor felt more real than anything he had ever known. But, as with all things, there were still unresolved tensions. Eleanor was still the CEO, the woman who had built an empire from nothing, and despite the moments of vulnerability they shared, there was always a wall she kept up. Mark could see it when they attended business events, where Eleanor slipped into a role as the untouchable businesswoman once again. He would watch her from across the room, the distance between them not just physical, but emotional as well. It was as if she could turn off her feelings the moment she stepped into that world. Mark had yet to understand how to navigate that part of her. One evening, they attended a charity gala, a grand affair with elaborate decorations, expensive wine, and the city's wealthiest crowd mingling under the glittering chandeliers. As usual, Eleanor was a vision in her dress, commanding attention the moment she entered the ballroom. Mark had been by her side all evening, but he noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor as they mingled with her colleagues. She was distant, detached, a woman of business and power, and he could feel the invisible wall between them growing higher with every passing moment. Later, when the evening came to a close, and they were back in the car heading home, Eleanor sat in silence, staring out of the window, her face illuminated by the streetlights passing by. Mark was unsure of what to say, the events of the night still fresh in his mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Eleanor, what happened back there?" he asked softly, his voice gentle. "You seemed so distant, almost like we were strangers." He watched her profile, the way her eyes moved as she processed his words. Eleanor didn't immediately respond. She kept her eyes on the window, her fingers lightly tapping the side of her seat. Mark could sense the hesitation in her, and for a moment, he wondered if this was the barrier he had been afraid of all along, the part of her she couldn't let go of. After a long pause, Eleanor finally spoke, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's not that I don't want to be close to you, Mark," she said, her words carefully chosen. "It's just, this world, it's all-consuming. And I've spent so many years building it that sometimes, I forget how to step outside of it. How to be something other than the CEO. I've been so focused on control, on power, that I've forgotten how to let go. Letting people in, really letting them," and she stopped herself, her voice trailing off. Mark's heart ached for her. He had seen the strong, composed Eleanor, but now he was beginning to see the cracks in her armor. "I get it," he said quietly. "I've been there too. I've spent so much time trying to survive, just getting by, that I didn't know how to live. But I'm learning, Eleanor. I'm learning that living isn't just about surviving. It's about sharing it with someone else. Being vulnerable, even when it's hard." He reached out and placed a hand over hers, his touch gentle but reassuring. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes softening as they locked with his. She didn't pull away this time, and for the first time that night, the walls between them seemed to crumble, just a little. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can be the person you need me to be." Her eyes glistened, the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long finally surfacing. Mark squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to be perfect, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady and warm. "You don't have to be anyone other than who you are. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for you, for the real you. And I'm here, no matter what." His words hung in the air, and Eleanor, for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to believe them. The car pulled up to the estate, and as they stepped out into the cool night, Eleanor looked at Mark with a small, hesitant smile. "Maybe we don't have all the answers," she said softly. "But maybe, together, we can figure it out." Her hand brushed his, and Mark felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of hope that he hadn't realized he was missing. As they walked inside, side by side, Mark realized that while the road ahead might still be uncertain, they were no longer walking it alone. And that was enough. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor found themselves settling into a new normal. What had once been a contracted simple business arrangement had slowly transformed into something far more meaningful. They no longer kept to their roles as husband and wife only when the world was watching. Now, when the doors were closed, and the lights dimmed, they were simply Mark and Eleanor. Two people who had found something unexpected in each other. They spent evenings talking about everything and nothing, learning the small details about each other that they had never known before. They shared laughter, long silences, and quiet moments of connection, and slowly, the emotional distance that had once separated them faded away. It was on a quiet evening, months after they had signed the contract, that Mark realized just how far they had come. He sat in the study, his gaze fixed on the window as the rain softly pattered against the glass. Eleanor had just finished a meeting, and for the first time, she was able to sit with him, without the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She walked over to him, her footsteps light, and without a word, she sat beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound being the rhythm of the rain. Mark turned to her, a soft smile spreading across his face. "I never thought we'd end up here," he said quietly. "I came into this thinking it was just a way out of my problems, but now I can't imagine my life without you." His voice was filled with warmth, and Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked at him. "I never thought this would be how things turned out either," Eleanor replied, her voice just as soft. "But in a way, I'm glad it did. I've spent so much time in control of everything, and in doing so, I forgot what it was like to truly live. To feel." She paused, taking a deep breath, and looked into Mark's eyes. "You've shown me that there's more to life than just building walls. There's joy in being open, and being vulnerable. And that's something I never thought I would experience again. Not after everything I've been through." Mark reached out and gently took her hand in his, the touch sending a quiet warmth through both of them. "You don't have to be perfect, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not asking for perfection. I'm just asking for you. The real you." He squeezed her hand, the sincerity in his eyes clear. "I know this hasn't been easy, but I believe in us. And I believe in what we have." He paused for a moment, searching her face as if trying to find the right words. "I never thought a contract would bring me this, but here we are. And I wouldn't change a thing." Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, Mark thought she might pull away, but instead, she leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm glad I didn't push you away, like I've done with everyone else." She let out a small, almost imperceptible laugh, her voice soft but genuine. "Maybe we weren't meant to find each other the conventional way. Maybe this was how it was supposed to happen. One step at a time, learning to trust again." She looked up at him, her expression full of something Mark could only describe as hope. "And I'm ready, Mark. Ready to see where this journey takes us." She smiled, the warmth of her smile filling the room. Mark smiled back, his heart full. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The uncertainty that had plagued him when he first arrived at this mansion had slowly faded, replaced by something solid, something real. He leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her face as he whispered, "I'm ready too. And wherever we go from here, we'll go together." The rain continued to fall outside, but inside, there was no more doubt. They had found something beautiful together, something neither of them had expected but both of them had needed. And as they sat there, side by side, Mark knew that this was just the beginning. The beginning of something lasting, something that wasn't built on contracts or obligations, but on love, trust, and the willingness to take a leap of faith.